Hello, everyone. Today I have Matt with me from Matt versus Japan, a fellow YouTuber. So you can say hi and introduce yourself.
Yeah, hey guys, I'm Matt. I have a YouTube channel called Matt vs. Japan. I also have a website, massimmersionapproach.com, and I kind of specialize in Japanese learning. I spent 5 years studying Japanese very intensively, and I've reached what I consider to be a pretty impressive level. And I'll make a lot of videos talking about learning Japanese. I'm also just starting to broaden out and talk more about language learning in general. So, yeah, thanks for having me on today.
Yeah, it's definitely a pleasure. I remember the first video of yours that I saw that definitely caught my attention was your video about the proper way to study kanji, and that of course goes into the RTK Method, the remembering the kanji textbook. And I would say that, first of all, I definitely learned quite a few things from your video. And I do agree with most of your points, but there were a few things that I couldn't quite agree with. So let me just introduce my own kind of method that I use for studying kanji. So I am of the opinion that you should not study kanji using a textbook. I think that the kanji from Genki 1 and Genki 2 are good enough as a starting point.
And how many? I don't know that much about Genki. So how many kanji is that, and which kanji are they?
It's 349 kanji. They are mostly frequency based, and it kind of uses an in-context approach where it'll introduce new vocabulary and then it'll make you learn the kanji as well.
Cool.
Most of the kanji and the order as well are good enough, I would say, as a starting point.
Okay.
So maybe you can take a look at the way Genki teaches kanji afterwards. But I don't really like how they teach kanji in their separate kanji textbook, which again ties into my opinion that you shouldn't use like kanji textbooks, which there are plenty of out there, I would say. I think that a better method, once you have that kind of basic knowledge of kanji, I think a good method to study them is to just study them in context as you go along. So if you're studying more and more words that use certain kanji, it is probably a good idea to study those kanji because that is a good indication that they are useful. So I never study kanji that I don't already know any words for. I do know that there are some issues with the purely in context approach, but I have personally found ways of avoiding them. So the first issue mentioned in your video was that you don't really have like any keyword, right, for certain kanji. And many kanji have the same list of meanings. So that wouldn't even be a good way to remember them and distinguish them from one another. But the way I avoid that problem is I just basically, in my Anki, I will just have those same meanings. You might take this as a joke, but I'll literally just say, this is not these other kanji that have the same meanings. And then I have to kind of shake my memory up a bit to remember which specific kanji this card is talking about.
Okay, so you're making production cards, you're saying, where you're trying to get yourself to write a certain kanji from memory, given a certain cue?
Yes. So I have two types of cards where I have the kanji and I have to remember relevant meanings and readings. By relevant, I mean those that I have actually studied. Okay, so here I have the kanji for sode, right? The kanji for sleeve. According to my card, it also has the meaning to give someone the cold shoulder, and it can have a meaning like the wing, as in the wing of a building. right? The left wing or the right wing. Also, it has a reading shu. So from all of this, I would only have to remember sode and sleeve, because the only word I know that contains this kanji is the word sleeve. And then the other card would be, it would be the exact opposite. It would just give me the readings and the meanings, and I would have to remember from memory how to write it. And luckily, Anki has the whiteboard feature where you can just literally write on your screen. So I just use that.
When you say it gives you the readings and the meanings, so then that kind of seems weird that you have two cards. So one card is just the meaning, and you recall the reading and the kanji, and the other one has the meaning and the reading, and you just recall the kanji?
No. So the reading and meaning of the kanji are together on the same side of the card.
Okay, so you mean one of them on the front of the card you have the kanji and the reading, and then you recall the meaning, you're saying?
No. On one side, I just have one character, just the kanji itself. Nothing else is written there.
Oh, and then you recall okay, I see. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
I know that some people separate them into 3 different groups where you study kanji,
I see it, yeah.
then you study the meanings, and then you study the readings. I don't like separating the readings and meanings. I like to have them kind of connected. And I also, whenever I'm recalling the readings and meanings, I also try to make a conscious effort to remember which words those actually correspond to. So it wouldn't just be a matter of having to remember almost like a quiz, right? Because then I wouldn't actually be studying the kanji. I would just be treating this as a game almost, which is something that you actually touched on in your recent SRS video.
Yeah.
Instead, I try to actually think of the words that have the kanji and what the readings are and the meanings. And if of course, some words will use a kanji and they'll just have a one-off reading of it. Like, for example, the word tsuitachi, right? That uses ichi and hi, but none of those actually correspond to the reading tsuitachi. That is just kind of a set word, right? So those I would just kind of treat separately. That's those two together are tsuitachi, first date.
So basically, are you saying that you're learning Japanese, so you're saying you build a tiny foundation with Genki, just following their instructions, and then you're just out in the wild learning Japanese as you come across it, and when you come across a kanji that you deem worthy of learning, then you create these style of cards. And so it sounds like you're not really making mnemonics to remember them in terms of their components. You're kind of just brute forcing it.
I do that whenever I need it. A lot of the time, so these days, I pretty much only learn kanji that I've already encountered many times. And actually, this kanji, sode, I did know it pretty much before I added it to my notebook. I could, if I saw the kanji in a sentence, I would either immediately recognize that it's sleeve, or from context, I would be like, oh yes, this kanji meant sleeve. That means that I don't really just know the 1,350 kanji I have in my Anki. I know more than that, but I haven't properly studied the others.
Okay. So you're saying a lot of the times by the time you're getting around to making the card, you've been exposed to it enough where it's actually quite easy to just remember how it's written.
Yes. And if it's not, then I will create a mnemonic. And in the beginning,
How will you make the mnemonics if you aren't familiar with the components in it? How would you go about doing that?
Okay, so that is another issue that I was going to touch upon. Sometimes when I just can't think of a mnemonic, I will just go out of my way to look up a certain radical, see what it means, and just use that. And somehow it's been very easy to just immediately memorize a certain radical as having a certain meaning, even though I haven't properly studied it with the RTK method. So I'll give you an example.
Okay.
There is the radical for axe, right? Which is used quite a lot in Japanese. But it's not used much at all as a standalone kanji. I think the most common word I was able to find using the kanji for axe was it had a couple million results on Google search, which is very few. Usually you expect tens of millions.
Are you talking about this kanji? Yeah, I know words that use that, but yeah, it's relatively uncommon.
But anyways, the point is, it's not a very common kanji, and I don't find it very useful to study right now. I still know what it means. I still know how to write it. If I saw it in a sentence, I would kind of assume that it has something to do with an axe. And whenever I see it in other kanji, it's easier to make a mnemonic thinking like of something getting chopped. I've never had difficulty remembering that this radical is the radical for axe, even though I've heard it literally once, somewhere like in passing. Yeah, that's kind of how I get around that problem. If I can't think of a mnemonic without knowing the radical, I'll just look up what the radical is. I do remember there was some example where I just couldn't remember a kanji, and then I had to look up one of its radicals, but I can't quite remember what it was. But that definitely happens, so I do that sometimes. But most of the time, I am able to come up with a mnemonic without knowing the different radicals. And a lot of the time, the radicals I would have already studied as other kanji anyways. Probably the most common radical is the ninben radical. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it seems like it's one of the most common.
It's certainly extremely common.
Yeah, that I obviously would have studied before I studied a kanji like yasumu, which would be very easy to remember. It's a person sleeping under a tree. Very obvious mnemonic that I think most people probably use. But these days, I don't even need to make a mnemonic because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm usually exposed enough to a kanji by the time that I study it. And there is the issue that I think probably most Japanese learners have to deal with, which is very similar looking kanji. Like you even brought up an example in your video with, I don't remember what the other one was, but one of them was Midori, I think.
Yeah, and N was the other one.
Stuff like that, what I do with that is, maybe it's kind of counterintuitive, but what I like to do is just put them all into one place, have all of the meanings like right next to each other, and all of the kanji right next to each other, and then pay attention to the differences between them, and that makes it a lot easier for me personally to remember them and to be able to tell them apart. I did have some difficulty recently remembering 3 kanji for sen, the kanji for Midori, and the second kanji from Kiroku. And I did the same thing. I just put them 3 in the same place, looked at what the differences were, and that made it a lot easier to remember. That's how I get around that problem, and I think that's probably one of the better ways to do it. I don't really know how other Japanese learners get around that problem. Do you know, could you tell me how the RTK method gets around the problem?
Well, basically it would be through making mnemonics, right? Like, because even if 2 radicals look similar, they're probably going to have totally different meanings. And so if you have a mnemonic that's story-based, then you're unlikely to confuse them.
Yeah.
I'd say.
Yeah. I guess that's also a very good method. I relied a lot more on mnemonics when I started studying kanji, but then I kind of just transitioned to just remembering them from exposure. I should probably get back to mnemonics when it comes to very similar looking kanji to be able to tell them apart very easily.
Well, also, so wait, was there more you wanted to talk about your method?
I think that is the gist of it. Yeah, basically all of the kanji that I study come from the vocab that I learned. The reason I don't quite like the idea of the RTK method is that for the first 3 months that you're studying the kanji, you're not really studying the language. And I'm generally very impatient. And when I first started studying Japanese, I really just wanted to get into it head deep, like as soon as possible. And I even remember how, like, I first spoke to a Japanese person, like, maybe a week or, like, a couple weeks into my process of studying. And as you can imagine, it was a horrible experience. I had to just use hiragana, and I didn't even know all of the hiragana because I didn't realize some of them could be smaller and they would be read a bit differently.
Oh, yeah.
So that's how early it was in my process of studying Japanese. So that's why I kind of haven't even considered a method where you study kanji almost like you study kana. You get it out of the way and then you keep going with Japanese.
Well, I mean, I could argue for RTK, but I actually have changed my opinion on the best way to go about learning kanji a lot since I made that video.
Oh, wow.
I made that video that you're talking about a year and a half ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of, the way that I advise people to go about learning kanji now is pretty different than that. So,
could you tell me about that?
yeah. So the way that I think about it is that there's being able to read kanji and being able to write kanji out are two completely different skills.
Yeah,
And
I agree.
there's no real need to cultivate both of those skills at the same time.
Yeah.
Now, the reason why it's important to recognize how separate those skills are is because if you can think about how in English, right, how it's very common to be able to read a word and not be able to spell it.
Yeah.
And that's because when you're reading a word, you're not actually looking at all the individual letters. Your brain kind of sees all the letters in a word as one complete picture. And
Yes.
when you're actually fluent in Japanese, it's the same for kanji, right? When you see a word, your brain isn't looking at the strokes. It sees the whole blob of kanji as one single thing. And this is why it's possible, for example, to read really messy handwriting when people are like not even actually writing all the strokes. They're kind of just blurring them all together. Or if you played like a Famicom game, like if you played the original Dragon Quest games, then, you know, there's not very many pixels. So there's not even enough pixels for them to write all of the strokes. Yet you can still tell what kanji it is because the overall vague look of it matches, right?
Yeah.
And so the abilities that you need to be able to read kanji are the ability to take in the whole character as one single picture. And that's totally different than the abilities you need to be able to write it out, which is to actually have in your memory what are all the individual radicals, what are the radicals comprised of stroke-wise, and so on.
Yeah.
And so what I realized is that if you can learn how to read Japanese without ever learning how to write it, and if you get very, very good at reading Japanese, then learning how to write it after the fact is actually extremely easy. Just like how it's pretty easy to learn how to spell a word that you can read, because, you know, if, for example, if you take a word that you don't know that you don't know how to spell, but you can read it, when you misspell it, you know you've misspelled it, right? Because it looks wrong.
Yeah.
And if you keep, maybe you've all done this thing where you're like taking a test and you don't know how to spell a word and you write down like 3 different possibilities on the side of the page because you know which one looks right if you happen to get it right.
Yeah.
And you have a vague image. When you close your eyes, you can see what the look of the word in your mind's eye.
Yeah.
And
I've done that a few times myself.
Yeah, and so if you get really good at reading Japanese, then you try to learn how to write Japanese, it's going to be super easy because you're going to almost be able to see the kanji in your mind's eye. And so you don't have to use mnemonics. You don't have to really think of them in terms of the radicals. It just takes a little bit of practice, and it comes so quickly because your brain is so fluent in the language of kanji. Right. Yeah. And it kind of sounds like you've already been experiencing this, right? You're saying, oh, well, definitely. I used to rely on mnemonics more. Now I don't, because I can kind of just see a kanji and remember it, right? It's kind of like how you can meet someone for the first time, and as soon as you see their face, your brain has kind of just created a memory of their face that you never forget, right? You could not see that person for 2 years, and if you ran into them on the street, you might not remember where you met them or who they are, but their face would still look familiar to you, right? It doesn't just look like a random combination of eyes and nose or whatever. It's like your brain sees, oh yeah, this is this person's face. It's very, very good at recognizing that. And it becomes the same thing with kanji. It becomes, oh, this is that kanji. It has this look. And so even if you're talking about like kanji that look similar, like sen or midori and stuff like that, once you're really fluent in Japanese, like you get to that point where you can read Japanese novels and it's not a big deal, they start to not look that similar anymore. Right? It's like the subtle differences. Your brain has become so trained to notice the subtle differences that really they look different enough to you. Just like you can imagine how, like for example, a lot of American people say that all Asian people look the same to them.
Yeah.
And Japanese people say that all white people look the same to them. Right?
Yeah.
But if you actually move to the country and you start spending a lot of time with them, you start to get better and better at noticing the differences. And then suddenly you're like, oh, all Japanese people look totally different. How could I ever think that, right? It becomes the same thing. It's like what used to seem similar, you start to notice more subtle and subtler distinctions. So the way that I started, so basically, my original idea with remembering the kanji was, well, just kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Learn how to recognize them and learn how to write them all in one go, and that will save you time in the end. But what I realized is that learning how to write the kanji before you're fluent in reading Japanese is possible for sure. and that's what RTK allows you to do. But it's not easy. It takes a lot of time and effort, and most people who try to take that approach, even the ones who are successful, they go through a lot of frustration and a lot of struggle, right? Like no one's ever said, "Oh yeah, I did remembering the kanji. It was a breeze, great time." Right? Some people, most people are like, "Yeah, it sucked. It was torture. I somehow got through it." Yeah. And some people say it was worth it, and some people don't. And most people don't get through it. That's the reality, right? Most people who try to do remembering the kanji don't make it through because it's just so brutal and so dry and challenging.
Yeah.
And so, and there's other issues, right? Where associating a kanji with a specific English keyword, it's possible, but as the intervals on your Anki cards get bigger, then you start to confuse all the different synonyms between the different keywords, and once your mnemonic starts to fade, then suddenly the intervals are like, whatever. I could go more into it, but basically there's a lot of issues that I've talked about before on my channel that make remembering the kanji in the way that I talked about in my video pretty difficult. And this is just an issue of theory versus practice, right? I made that video saying, oh, here's the theory. In theory, RTK is perfect. But if you actually go and talk to people who tried it, it's like all these issues, these unforeseen issues and struggles kind of became apparent.
Yeah.
And so I started to realize that it's probably better to first learn how to read Japanese and then learn how to write it later. And in fact, this is what I actually did. Because when I first started learning kanji, I used RTK, but I did this other method that was kind of new at the time, where instead of having the English keyword on the front of the card and then you recall the kanji, you have the kanji on the front of the card and then you just recall the meaning. And so basically it's now recognition instead of recall, right? You're not recalling the kanji, you're just recognizing the kanji.
Yeah.
And recall is a lot easier than recognition, so you build a lot weaker memories, basically.
Yes.
And so it's a lot easier and you get through it a lot more quickly, but you end up with pretty poor memories. And so by the time I had gotten through RTK and like a few months had passed, I was starting to fail all my Anki cards. My memories of all the kanji were super blurry. And I eventually just ended up deleting my Anki deck, and I didn't know the kanji very well. But what did happen was I had gotten to that point where when I look at a kanji, it was no longer just a random combination of squiggly lines, right? It looked like something. It had a look to it. Just like how when you look at a person's face, their face has a look to it, right? Because I had been trained to view the kanji in terms of the radicals, right? Like when I looked at a kanji, I saw, oh, it's this radical plus this other piece, or it's this plus this plus this. It wasn't just random squiggles like it is for someone who's never studied Japanese or Chinese before. And so because I was like, well, I just spent like 2 months doing just kanji, like you said, it's like I wanted to get into just learning Japanese already, right? And so even though I didn't know the kanji that well, I started to just learn words. I just, come across a new word and I just memorized like, okay, when these two kanji are next to each other, it means this, right? Like,
yeah.
And so, like before that, right? Remembering the kanji, you don't learn kanji readings at all. You just learn character and basic meaning. And so I didn't know any readings, and even my memories of the meanings were super blurry. But I would just learn a word, like let's say I come across it's a random Japanese word, like maybe I come across sode, and it's like, okay, I look it up, sode means sleeve. And so then I would just make a flashcard that had a sentence, like maybe like, he put his arm through the sleeve of the shirt or whatever. And I just memorize, okay, this kanji in this context of this word, it's read like this and it means this. So I didn't really worry about individual kanji. I just worried about words, right? Because in reality, whatever you're doing with language, whether you're reading, writing, speaking, listening, you only have to know words, right? You don't have to really know what kanji mean in isolation. Yeah,
that's pretty much the approach that I take. I kind of try to focus on words more. And I think like most people would probably agree that when it comes to reading Japanese, or I guess Chinese would be pretty much the same, most people seem to misunderstand, and they think that when you're reading, you're like almost like decoding a cipher, when in reality it's just like, you remember that these three kanji together, they mean this word. You're not...
Yeah, and it's not even remembering, right? It's like once you're fluent, your brain instantly recognizes it.
Yeah.
Right? It's just like how when you see your friend's face, you know instantly who it is, right? You know it's like, oh yeah, that's Tim. Whatever. You don't have to like put together like, okay, well, this person's eyes are three centimeters apart and their nose is this far down, which means they must be Tim, right? It's like, that's not what happens. It's just instant recognition. And that's the same way once you train yourself to read kanji.
Yeah.
And so I didn't really worry about what kanji meant in isolation. Like, I didn't worry, like, okay, this kanji can mean sleeve, or to disregard, or to be the side of a plane. I just memorized the word sole. Okay, this is a word that means sleeve. Or if there was, like, multiple compound words, like, if it was, like, Tokyo, it's like, okay, Tokyo is these two kanji. When these two kanji are in this order, then that's Tokyo. And I just learned words this way. And I found that memorizing how to read a word was pretty easy if I just practiced it a little bit, because kanji, I'd at least gotten to the point where kanji weren't scribbles anymore. And I couldn't write them out. I wasn't memorizing what radicals they were, right? Like, for the first couple of years of me learning Japanese, if you would have handed me a pen and a paper and you said, like, well, write out the kanji for sode, I probably wouldn't be able to do it for most kanji. But when I saw it, I could read it. And so what I did was I just learned words and practiced reading Japanese every day. And I got better and better at reading. And after a certain point, I started to realize that if you did show me a kanji out of context and you asked me what it meant, I could tell you with a pretty high degree of accuracy what that kanji meant, because I could just naturally think, well, what are all the words I know that uses this kanji, and what do they all have in common?
Yeah.
All right. And also, if you ask me the readings, I could do the same thing. Like, I could tell you, oh, well, the readings, it has these 3 readings, because I would just think, oh, well, I know like 50 words that use this kanji, and in all of those 50 words, it has one of these 3 readings.
Yeah.
And so when I would come across a new word that I'd never seen before, in most cases, I could guess the reading and probably what the meaning was. But I never had to practice to be able to gain this skill. It just was cultivated naturally through learning lots of words. My brain did the pattern recognition for me.
Yeah.
And so by the time I was a few years into learning Japanese, I could read very fluently. I had read like 50 Japanese novels, but I still couldn't really write them out from hand. But what I did was, after that point, I went through RTK again, except instead of the English keywords, I just put Japanese keywords. And I found that it was very easy for me to learn how to write them out, because I was almost there already, right? I just had to practice it a couple times, and then it was there. So I was able to very quickly gain the ability to write it out, because I had already had so much infrastructure in my brain. And then I was able to write Japanese. And so this is how I learned, but for a long time, I viewed that as a failure, right? I viewed it as, oh, I messed up RTK. I did it the wrong way. You're supposed to do it with the keyword on the front, kanji on the back, but I did it kanji on the front, keyword on the back, and that's why I learned it poorly, and that's why I couldn't write Japanese for the first 3 years. I had to do it twice. That was a failure. If you did it just RTK correctly the first way, then that's more efficient, because you only have to go through it once. You're killing 2 birds with 1 stone.
Wait, hold on. Does it really matter which is on the front, considering that you always get the opposite anyways?
Well, I was only making 1 card per kanji. So I wasn't doing it both ways. So yeah, like I never practiced recalling the kanji. It was just recognition. It was just, I would look at it and remember what it meant. And that was it when I first did it. And so yeah, I viewed it as that was a failure. And what should happen is you learn it properly the first time, so that you don't have to go through it twice. You only have to go through it once. But after seeing people struggle with this so much, I actually had the epiphany that actually what I did was not a failure. It was actually quite an efficient way to go about it. So if you just go through the kanji first, really in a kind of quick and dirty fashion, it only takes a couple weeks, and you're not aiming for a high level of accuracy. You're just trying to get to that point, basically, where when you look at a kanji, it no longer looks like scribbles anymore. It has a certain look to it, right? It's that kanji, right? That's your only goal. You don't even have to know what it means very well, or the reading, or be able to write it out, or anything. You're just trying to go from scribbles to something.
Wait,
and after that, you could just learn words.
Am I getting this right? Are you saying the idea is you would go through the Joyo kanji list in 2 weeks just to be able to recognize them?
Well, what I'm recommending people to do now is what I did was I took the 1,000 most commonly used kanji in Japanese.
Yeah.
Which covers like over 90% of all of Japanese, right? It's like 94%
of
all of Japanese.
I definitely found that after like about 1,000, it is very hard to find new kanji to study. Like I set myself a goal to study 500 new kanji this year. At the beginning of the year, I had about 1,200. Now I'm still at 1,350, and it is just really difficult to find new useful kanji to study, because, as you mentioned, the top 1,000 are like 90% of Japanese.
Yeah, like it's literally more than 90%. And so what I did is I took the 90%, but I put them in the order of remembering the kanji
Hmm.
so that you can still get some of the benefit of learning them in terms of the radicals. And then I just made a simple Anki deck where it's just the kanji on the front and then not just a bunch of different meanings on the back. And so your goal is to kind of just and there's already stories for the mnemonics like on the card. So you kind of just go through this deck in a kind of really quick and dirty way. You can do it in like a month or two,
Hmm.
and that gets you a pretty good foundation. And then you just learn words, and you actually don't do what you're doing, where you're making cards just for kanji. You're just learning words and practicing reading Japanese, and you do that until you're basically fluent in reading, and
Yeah.
then you can go back and learn how to read. And you don't have to actually go through RTK. You could, if you wanted to get better at reading, you could just practice writing and pick it up pretty quickly, right? Like just start writing a diary in Japanese, and then if you can't remember how to write a kanji, just look it up, and then you'll probably remember it
Yeah.
because you have so much infrastructure in your brain. So you can just learn by actually doing the thing.